who just joined us? All right, well, hi, Michael, can you hear us now? Oh, he's muted, okay. Michael, if you can hear us, can you unmute yourself?
Yep, okay, I'm on.
I think we're ready to get started. Noreen, you still there?
Yeah, can you hear me?
Yeah, we can hear you.
Okay.
So you want
all right, I'll go ahead and get started. Thanks everybody for making time. I know there's a lot of stuff going on. So today, Eric Dumba is going to be talking about his work. I did also want to mention that we have the next 2 research calls planned to offer. We'll be talking, I think it's January is the next date, and then Chris will be joining us from Australia. Although we'll have to check that it won't be in the middle of the night for him, but tentatively he's scheduled to do the second date in 2018. I'll be following up with other people to flesh out the rest of the dates in the spring semester that we have, so that'll probably come a little bit before the holidays. So that was all I had. I'll turn it over to Carolyn and Laura so that they can give us a few updates before Eric gets into his presentation.
Well, this is Jennifer. Caroline is actually out of the country right now. So we'll go ahead and take care of these quick reminders, and I have them up on the screen. You can see right there. A reminder that your Year 1 project tracking sheet is due this coming Friday, and I've been in touch with, I think, everybody, just as a reminder that they are due this Friday. That was an extended deadline, and thank you to everybody who have already turned theirs in. Also due this Friday are the performance indicator templates, and the next deadline after that is the Year 2 project information form. And then, of course, going to January with the next PPPR. But those are the main upcoming deadlines. Just a reminder that you can always check deadlines on our new CSCRS reporting page. And if we have time at the end, I'll show that page again. But all of this information and forms that you need to do this reporting, they're all available there if you need them. Are there any?
And we're going to be sending out a little bit of additional guidance and clarifications on the performance indicator template. We had some good conversations this morning with Noreen and Steve about how to go through that form, and there are going to be some places that are going to be more or less relevant for different consortium members. So look for some guidance coming out from Nancy on that shortly.
Any more information on that? Yeah. Okay. Are there any questions about these deadlines or reminders before we get into the research part, Eric's presentation? All right. Well, I'm going to give you control, Eric, and we'll get this started.
Okay.
Hi, this is offer. I still haven't fully figured out how the Skype things work, but I just wanted to say that I'm working on it, and hopefully we'll figure it out in a minute or two.
Okay. So it may take, we were practicing this earlier and it took a little while to get, to make the transition. So it just may take a second or two.
Yeah, it's coming up here. You guys got it?
You got it?
Yep.
All right, so you guys are going to get a twofer today. I'm going to do the first one in talking about some of the outcomes of the literature review and the focus group stuff we've been doing to present a model for safe systems in urban environments. And then Lewis is going to do the second. We're going to do a tag team and hand it off to him and talk about the built environment and traffic safety project that he's been leading with us. All right. So to begin, one of the interesting things as I start going through the safe systems literature is that it feeds back into behavioral psychology, it feeds back into social psychology, industrial systems, and going through this material leads one to look a little differently at the nature of safety. So the outline of what I'm going to talk about is, first, I'm going to present the issue of counterfactual reasoning, which is, from a psychological perspective, how we try to understand causation for accidents, and then we're going to show how that leads to the way we look at safety today, and it also puts blinders on us to some of the issues that we might otherwise look at. And I'm going to illustrate that with the case of Raquel and AJ Nelson, and then go forward a little bit and illustrate how taking a systems approach, a broader perspective, might help us better understand crashes. And in that, I'm going to use an illustration of research in the arena of urban roadside safety. And then I will conclude with the model of safe systems, and then we'll kick the next PowerPoint over to Lewis. So counterfactual reasoning is something that people innately do. It's a form of logic. And what we try to do is we look at an adverse consequence that we regard as aberrant, abnormal, and then we try to figure out what caused it. So what we then do is look upstream, or rather backstream in time, to try to figure out what antecedent deviated from the norm and what is a result, if we could switch that upstream behavior, how that might have presented or prevented the consequence. Now there's a lot of work by Daniel Kahneman on this, and Rose. There's a couple of things that shape the way we construct this counterfactual content. The first is outcome closeness. So we tend to focus on those antecedents that are immediately proximate to consequences. So we try to look for the thing that is nearest both in space and in time. So it leads us to look at things that are very close. The second concept is outcome normality, which is exceptional outcomes, such as a crash, are presumed to follow from exceptional antecedents, which is traffic violations, aberrant behavior, and the like. And what we do is we try to construct counterfactuals that shift that antecedent to a normal value. So we would, for example, look at a crash, try to identify that behavior immediately prior to the crash that we believe caused it, and then try to shift that to a normal state, which leads us to then make the conclusion that, well, we could have prevented the crash with that. And then the other thing that applies are extant norms. So counterfactual content is based on norms of expected behavior, or what we expect people to do. And these are things that are modifiable and they're socially constructed. So a lot of the safety culture issues that emerge sort of play into this. So the expectation that people won't text and drive, or people won't drink and drive. These are norms of conduct that we expect people to adhere to. All right. And what this leads to is there's a model of how we often deal with safety today, which is we look at an individual's behavior and we try to identify those errors and violations that resulted in a crash. And when we try to intervene in the engineering side, we do that by introducing defenses that are expected or attempting to prevent that individual from the crash. So this will deal with things like traversable roadside hardware, or clear zones, or wider lanes, or in the case of vehicles, vehicle stop detect on the approach, cameras, and these sorts of things. So these are the types of defenses that we engineer in to prevent the individual from getting into a crash as a result of errors or violations. Okay? And you see this the way we report critical factors. We categorize 94% of crashes as being attributable to behaviors on the part of drivers or pedestrians, right? A very small percent, and this is, there are variations of this. You ever see between 90 and 95, right? But the majority of crashes are attributed to critical issues that the driver made, which leads us to start focusing on how we can address that behavior of the driver or engineer solutions that will minimize the consequences of that behavior. And those problems are things like recognition error. They didn't recognize what they were supposed to do. They made a poor decision. They made bad performance, so they were speeding or not some ways violating what they were supposed to do. non-performance error like sleeping. So these are how we try to understand the causal actions that resulted in a crash, right? And it leads us to focus a lot of our safety efforts on these sorts of things. Don't drink and drive campaigns. Eyes on the road, don't drive distracted. These are all attempting to prevent those upstream behaviors. Now, we've been doing this for a long time. We've been doing this since they're in the main push and the creation of NHTSA and these things in the early 1970s. We had a reduction in crashes during the recession, but these have started to go up. And as most of you guys know, we're back up to 40,000 traffic fatalities a year. What we're doing, we had that nice reprieve from crashes, and we spent a lot of time professionally applauding ourselves for the great work. But really, you can look at that as simply a hiccup associated with the lagging economy, things picking back up. The fatalities are going right back to where they were before. I think I saw something that we have this last year, the biggest one-year growth in traffic fatalities that we've recorded in like 50 years. I mean, we're going backwards now. And so the issue is, we can't address this by doing the same things that we've always been doing. We may have reached a plateau on what we can achieve. Part of that is we still have this mentality where we're blaming the victim. We're attributing the problem to the driver. So this is from the Governor's Highway Safety Association that came out after the traffic fatalities for 2016 were there. It's still the same things that are killing people. It's belts, booze, and speed. If we can only change that driver, right? If we can only get people to behave the way we expect them to, well, then these problems wouldn't occur. Now, the problem with this sort of counterfactual reasoning is it can lead to some pretty gross and unjust outcomes. And the case I want to talk about today is one. This happened in Atlanta. It was the case of Raquel Nelson and the death of her son, AJ, and a traffic fatality. Now, what happened was Raquel and AJ, she had 3 kids, single mom of 3 kids, doesn't own a car. She had, for one of the kids' birthdays, she had taken the bus up to Chuck E. Cheese, then came back. They missed the bus when it was supposed to come, so they're now delayed. She's coming back with 3 kids. I believe they were 2, 3, and 5, right? Coming back with her kids, gets to the bus stop. They try to cross the street where the bus lets them off, adjacent to her apartment. They make it to the median. They're crossing an arterial. They make it to the median, and AJ steps out into that median and is struck by a drunk driver, right? And at this point in time, the drunk driver, I think he did something like 6 weeks for this, but she was also arrested and charged with vehicular manslaughter. And she was not only tried in Georgia, she was convicted for the death of her son. Now, if we look at this is where this location occurred. If we look at this, right, the normal way we would view this is, well, what should she have done? What were the errors or violations that occurred? And you can see here's where the bus stop let her off. This is Austell Road. She crossed. AJ got struck in the outside opposing lane before they can make it to her apartment complex on the other side. Now, if we look at this from a normal safety perspective, well, the error was that she didn't cross at the signalized crosswalk, which is about a quarter mile up the road, right? She crossed at that location. But if we think reasonably, those of you with kids know this, when you have young children walking a quarter mile up, crossing the street, walking a quarter mile back, that's about a 10-minute walk in good conditions. You got 3 sleepy kids, that can be a mess. She did what I think most reasonable people would have done. I don't need to go up, half a mile. I just need to go across the street. I need to travel about 50, 60 feet of road to get home. Well, that didn't work out for her. She was tried and convicted for this. And it's unreasonable to stop and say, well, this is simply a matter of errors and violations, and if we could have shifted her behavior, that would have addressed that problem. If you start looking upstream, there are environmental factors here that have been put into place, error-producing conditions. So the decision to locate that apartment complex on the arterial, the decision to place that bus stop there, the failure to provide a crosswalk in those conditions in an area where we know that there's demand. We could have put a pedestrian signal in here to prevent that. These are all environmental conditions that could have been put in place. And then there are also organizational ones. So general policies on the distances for bus stops, general policies on the placement of crosswalks. These are things that have been organizationally made, decisions that were made without any real application to the crash downstream. They were done in some sense in a vacuum. Nonetheless, those decisions, though they in no way could have foreseen this crash, nevertheless had the outcome to help produce it. All right. Which means we really need to, instead of focusing on driver error, we need to focus on two types of failure. The first is active failure. These are actions taken by people who have direct responsibility for the system. And people make slips, they make lapses, they make mistakes, and we need to account for those in design. But we also need to pay attention to latent failures that we design in without many times any regard for their safety effects. These are policy conditions that result in dormant conditions that, when combined with active triggers, lead to crashes. To put this another way, that's like having a gun and loading it and leaving it nearby until somebody pulls the trigger. All the conditions were embedded in those upstream policy decisions. All it took was the action later on to pull the trigger. All right. So this is an active failure pathway, but we've also got a latent failure pathway that comes upstream from these organizational decisions that we often don't think of as being related to safety, to the crash effect. So these are things like land use policies that we put in place without regard to how that might influence the incidence of traffic-related injury and death. So to take this a step further, I want to show, as an illustration, some of the work in roadside safety that's been put in place, and specifically in urban environments. Now, we deal with roadside crashes. This is when, for one reason or another, a driver runs off the roadway and crashes into a fixed object located adjacent to the right-of-way. So crashing into trees and utility poles, single vehicle crashes. We have a presumed encroachment pattern, which is a driver, for one reason or another, lack of attention, drunk driving or the like, veers off the road and hits. And the presumption is that these things are random and unpreventable. It's simply a cause of driver error. So we should provide roadsides that are clear of fixed objects. And when we look at the literature on two-lane rural roads, on which most of these policies are based, generally this supports this conclusion. You'll see a disproportionate share of crashes occur along curves, but in general, the elimination of those roadside objects is going to address runoff roadway events. And that's exactly the sort of reasoning that we saw before. The individual, for one reason or another, engages in an error or violation. We put in engineering defenses to prevent them from those consequences, and they can lead to crashes. I'll just skip at this point. So I got into this issue probably about 12, 15 years ago now, because my interest is in urban design and urban street design, and I kept running into problems on my projects where I couldn't get many of these walkable streets into place because of care zone policy. That the argument was, well, these things are, these roadside appurtenances, these trees, these things are roadside hazards, unsafe, and we can't do them. So I wanted to look at this in urban environments. And what I was surprised at, even though we try to apply this policy in urban environments where we could, the literature on this is actually pretty weak. The issue that was used for the study that was used for the application of this in urban environments was a study that compared data from rural Michigan to what was described as urban data for Huntsville, Alabama. And what they did is they plotted for the crashes in these environments the distance between the roadside object that was struck and the right-of-way. And what we see here in this is that the majority of crashes occurred, about 90% of crashes occurred within 30 feet of the right-of-way. Right? They did it for Huntsville and they did it for Michigan. They saw that these curves are about the same. And they made the conclusion, well, the same sort of solution should apply. All right? That if you provide a 30-foot clear zone, you'll eliminate 90% of those crashes. That was the logic that was used in this application. Right? So part of my dissertation work, I went out and I started doing field investigations, urban arterials. So I went out and examined the right-of-way, the geometry. I had the police reports. I did crash reconstructions for about 27 miles, a roadway that ran through two cities, Ocala and DeLand, Florida. Right, so I've got this from rural to suburban transition, suburban to urban, all the way through, and I plotted out those crashes. Now, what I found was the same thing that... Sounds like somebody's eating.
Can you please mute
Everybody
your
put themselves
microphone?
on mute besides Eric.
Okay, all right.
There? Okay. So I mapped those crashes and I found almost the exact same thing. 90% of those crashes were occurring from 30 feet of the right of way. Okay. And then I plotted out the proportion of offsets of that roadway with those right of way, and what I found was that they perfectly mirrored each other. Stated this another way, the only reason that 10% of the crashes occur on urban roadways with 30-foot clear zones is only because 10% of the urban right of way had 30-foot clear zones. It perfectly matched the section offset. So to state it another way, there was no distinction between crash frequency and clear zone offset distance. It was simply a function of the exposure that people had to those sorts of clear zones. So the next game that we like to play is we like to do correlational analyses to see how things are related to one another, right? So I plugged in the normal variables, shoulder width and fixed object. I separated those things. I popped in a variable for livable streets, for these walkable configurations, controlling for ADT, lane, number of lanes, lane width, median widths, and these sorts of things. And I'll sort of get to the punchline here. Quickly, shoulders were consistently associated with increases in crashes. So you put a shoulder on an urban street, you get more crashes, both roadside and fixed object. Wider fixed object offsets to the clear zone beyond the shoulder had a decrease in fixed object off crashes, but they actually led to a slight increase, though not statistically significant, in mid-block crashes. So any reductions in roadside crashes were offset by additional crashes that occur. Put it another way, none of this really explained what was going on very well. So next, I looked at livable streets. So these segments that had the trees and the appurtenances adjacent to the right-of-way, consistently associated with reductions of both fixed object and mid-block crashes. The punchline here, this is interesting, correlation is not causation, and we too often try to make generalizations based on correlational data that may be leading us astray. What's germane here, if we want to understand the urban fixed object crash, is to actually look at the locations themselves. These crashes, as it turns out, didn't follow the patterns that we presume. That the majority of them occurred like we see here on this illustration, where you've got an arterial thoroughfare with wider lanes, 12-foot lanes, and they're attempting operating speeds 35, 45 miles an hour, and they're attempting to turn. They're not going straight, and they're not randomly running off the road. They're trying to turn at a driveway or side street, and when they do that, they wind up crashing not at something located adjacent to the right-of-way, but actually an object at the back end of the curve of the adjacent street. So they make the turn too fast and they encroach on the back end. 83% of these crashes that we observed are associated with this location. There's nothing random about it at all. This is systematic. And you've got a combination of factors that come into play. You've got higher operating speeds on the arterial. You've got a driver attempting to make a turn, and then that approach speed resulting in an encroachment behind the driveway or side street. Right? Which gets us to this issue of latent error. These conditions are, if they're not random, how are they created? Well, they're created by organizational factors that are often put into place without regard for their safety effects. The functional class. We designate these roadways as an arterial. We have a certain presumption of traffic volumes and operating speeds that lead to certain types of designs. Those designs, in turn, are what create these conditions. You've got driveway and development policy. The policies on where we put driveways, how we allow them to have access to the arterial system, how wide they are. So are they wide enough to handle turns at the approach speeds on the arterial? And then clear zone policies as well. So when I would present this research, I did it a few times, a number of times, quite a bit actually, a few years back. And quite a few times I had people come up afterwards and they would tell me about projects in their communities where, you know, they were doing a safety project where they were eliminating trees, were the particular one, trees or poles. They're relocating these things back to make the roadway more safe. But what happened is they moved these objects away from the right-of-way, put them further back down the throat of those driveways or those intersections, and actually created crashes where crashes didn't exist before. Right? It's the problem with the clear zone policy that's not thoughtful on the precipitating factors that lead to these crashes. These aren't random. They're not necessarily violations. They're systematic, created by organizational decisions that have been made. So taking that perspective, we can put forward this model for safe systems and what that might look like. So upstream on the organizational side, the things that we need to start focusing our attention to are the safety effects of our zoning ordinances. Where are we allowing development to go? Our subdivision regulations, which control driveway policies and configurations. Regional development plans, which forecast where future growth is going to go and how that's going to be accommodated or not accommodated by safety interventions. Roadway functional class, when we designate a road as an arterial or collector, that comes with a presumption of some sort of design characteristics. And our performance measures, such as level of service. These things are responsible for the creation of project needs statements, which then determine the types of projects that get adopted and what sort of design solutions emerge out of the project development process. Going forward to environmental factors that come downstream from these organizational decisions, these decisions result in various geometric design features, and they result in the selection of design speeds and design vehicles for the roads we're using. Traffic control applications, what sort of traffic control devices are appropriate in the context? So are we going to put in the case of Raquel and AJ Nelson, are we going to put in a crosswalk or protected crossing for them? Driveway policies, and then right-of-way allocation, how we allocate space to individual users. And then we get further downstream and we start getting into more familiar territory. The errors and violations that we can target through education and enforcement, licensure practices, and legal sanctions for undesirable behavior. And then our engineering defenses that we're putting into place, the passive safety principles like our roadside design guide, intelligent vehicles, traversable hardware, and the like. So if we're moving forward to a model of safe systems, it's these upstream factors that I think are critically important for addressing safety in urban environments. That these are responsible for creating a lot of the downstream decisions that result in traffic-related death and injury. So that's the gist of my presentation. Just to let you guys ask a couple of questions if you have them, and then we'll kick it over to Lewis.
This is David Ragland. For FHWA, we're doing a series of roadway departure analyses for some workshops, and these are primarily in rural areas. But we find that in rural areas, there's about 60% of fatalities and severe injuries are roadway departure. In urban areas, it's about 30. But it's interesting, and maybe I'll send you some of these separately. But we have, two kinds of outcomes. One, if there's a tree area, it's hit object. But if it's an area where there's very few trees, then it's rollovers. And anyway, I'd be interested in your take on some of the analyses we're doing for these, and maybe I'll send them to you to get your feedback.
Yeah, I'd love to see that.
So, Eric Asad here, just a very nice conceptual structure that you have presented in this last slide that's up. My question is, have you thought of any kind of methods to analyze such data? For example, there's like a methodology called path analysis, and it could help us figure out what the effect, for example, of geometric design is on whatever enforcement, and how that in turn affects intelligent vehicles, and how that ultimately results in crashes. So I'm just mentioning it as more of a future research idea to use this kind of path analysis methodology. Have you given any thought to this?
I've heard of path analysis. I haven't investigated it, but if I understand it correctly, it's exactly the kind of thing that we need to be looking at. Because the problem here is when we're doing these correlation analyses, we're sort of dealing with this issue of disorganized complexity, where there's randomness in there, and we can tease that out by probabilistic models on there. But these are not random events. They're systematic events, and changes to any one facet of the environment is going to have an effect on the entire system. And if I understand path analysis correctly, that lets us start getting at those sorts of issues. And it also leads to something that personal sort of research pet peeve of mine is I often get attributed this idea that I think wider lanes are unsafe and come to that conclusion at all. But urban design folks seize on part of this and they leap to that conclusion, which causes me a lot of internal pain because they don't think wide lanes, and you see this in the research too, the results are so very mixed on how lane widths affect safety that it's really, if we're going to understand it correctly, we need to understand all the other factors that are interrelated with it in order to start getting at the design effects of that sort of feature. It's complex, and because we don't have the right models right now, we don't have good information of what solutions are right when. So I think, and I do need to do research, and if you know it, this might be a great partnership opportunity. I do need to do more work in that area.
Sure. Would love to talk to you more about that.
Hey, Eric, this is Steve Marshall. I think this is a really fantastic talk, and I agree with everything you've said, and really, really impressed, and thank you. And we need to schedule you to come and give some talks in our School of Public Health, because I think there's an audience for this.
All right, I'd love to do it.
Yeah, that would be great. We're going to make it happen.
All right. Well, we're going to get up there, I guess, at least once a year, right? So
yeah. So we're gonna set you up with a couple of slots. I think this model is what we are calling a mental map, rather than a model. And so I don't know how standardized we want to be about terminology, but we would definitely describe this last slide as a mental map, meaning it's your conceptualization. And I think it's an excellent one and very well informed. But we would definitely see a model as a step beyond, as a kind of aggregation of mental maps, or a step beyond mental maps. I guess, in the systems literature, we're sort of used to the idea. So it sort of looks like the layers of the socio-ecologic model. Mm-hmm. And I think we would, from a systems perspective, be interested in how the layers might interact. And obviously, I think you've got a linear set of arrows that are very powerful and drive the prevention context. But as you mentioned several times in your talk, there's also feedback loops between these different layers as well. People put crosswalks where pedestrians are getting hit. It's just a thought or a comment about whether we might want to maybe take your slide and maybe schedule another discussion on one of these calls.
Yeah, I would like to do that. And I know you do a really great job, stuff you were presenting when we had the retreat, a really good job of conceptualizing that. I think it would be wonderful.
Yeah. And I mean, the other thing is, we do need to be thinking about the layer up above the organizational layer, which is I call it the disorganizational layer. But that's the kind of things like the population of the United States and the price of gas. Mm-hmm. And those two factors, which are not readily modifiable by us, are probably the single exogenous factors that drive crashes. And we probably empirically, within our group, one thing we could think about doing would be a methodology for adjusting crashes for the price of gas and population growth. Because I think that and the price of gas is a very complicated thing to model. But I think that kind of jump that you alluded to, which is so concerning, it looks a little different once we adjust for population increase and the fact that gas has been low for a long period of time. So it's not the price of gas, but it's the perceived stability of a low price of gas that drives up crash rates.
Well, for that matter, we plotted, FHWA, I think, has a site where they have vehicle miles traveled and fatalities going back to 1920 or earlier, and we plotted that out. And it turns out that the ups and downs are highly correlated with economic changes like the Depression, with wars, and so on. And the latest uptick is just an example. But if you plot that and you put in an exponential function, it turns out that the mileage death rate has come down an average of 2.5% per year for the last 80 years or 90 years. And so there's some underlying phenomena going on of a increase in safety, even with the ups and downs with wars and economic cycles. And it would be interesting to factor those in, both economic cycles and wars and events like that, to see how predictive they are. Now, I don't know if we're going to see that same 2.5% per year average over projecting forward, but it'll be interesting to see.
We seem to have reached, we reduced deaths per mile traveled, but we seem to have reached a social baseline of 40-some thousand deaths per year. I think that's true since the 90s.
So you're breaking up.
We can drive a little more. We're still going to have the same number of people die every year in general. So is there some population threshold? I have no idea how. When you're dealing with, it would be interesting because both of you deal with these issues more than I do. But it would be interesting to see how those thresholds play themselves out. And I honestly don't have a good explanation for them.
This is Noreen. I'll send around a paper after this. I used the time use data to look at the recent decrease in fatalities and sort of show that there wasn't really one after you accounted for exposure. Because I think what David raises is a really interesting question: is has that sort of perpetual improvement in safety, is it still going on or not, right? Which is kind of a question mark. I did want to come back to one thing, and I know we need to get to Lewis, but sort of the point that Eric and Steve were making. Eric, what I was interested in was where you see the leverage points, because I thought that the example you gave of the woman being prosecuted was a wonderful illustration. But how do you get the system, or what are the mechanisms that allow the system to consider those upstream metrics, which your example showed are completely unconsidered? So is it an example of the legal systems being very different in Northern European countries? What are the leverage points, and is there sort of that mental map, systems map that Steve was talking about that might help us identify the leverage points?
By leverage point, are you meaning where do we engage in interventions and actions on the sector level?
Yeah. So, for example, you've laid out all these things that are upstream that influence safety, right? And we've kind of, that's, I think, largely recognized, but yet it doesn't seem to have radically changed practice, right? So how do you radically change practice?
I don't, and I'll throw this out, we sort of, we work in our individual context. I don't think any of this is particularly radical. So you're, coming back from NACDA in Chicago a couple of weeks ago. I mean, a lot of the environmental stuff, they're already dealing. And then one of the really interesting things that came out of that focus group, exciting and a little alarming, was already focusing on a lot of the error-producing conditions and altering designs to eliminate crashes. But they're doing it just like we've done in AASHTO. They're often doing it without any evidence base, and they're completely confident that they're right without any evidence to support it one way or another. So they're, on some ways, they're charging ahead with reducing speed, encouraging that, and encouraging crosswalks, protected crossings, and these sorts of things. But then they're also charging forward with things like lane width reductions, and none of this is necessarily based on evidence, based on what they think feels good. So that the environmental one, I feel pretty good about. It's a matter of keeping plugged in. NACTA was great because it's a social transmitter out to the cities, and cities are becoming increasingly important, and at least urban environments, on advancing practice. That plug-in is that hard to do. Just need to keep those relationships that, our center, we're making those. The organizational one, how do you get this upstream into regional development policies and these sorts of things? That's a little tougher. One would hope that you can plug into I don't know how much influence APA really has, but plug into these sorts of groups and get that integrated into the sorts of practice that they're promoting to professionals. That might be the leverage points that I would recommend. But again, that's in part because those are the layers in which I often intersect with the system. And I don't know that that's complete, and I know that it's probably a bit, given the amount of effect that these organizations might have. But that's how I would see it done.
Well, Ezra Hauer had an interesting paper a couple of years ago where he makes the point that these various guidance manuals, professional guidance manuals, and AASHTO, et cetera, once a practice gets in there, it may get in initially a few years ago without much evidence, and then from that point, it becomes gospel.
That's right.
And there's an inertia, according to Hauer, kind of deep within the professional, culture. I'm not an engineer, so I don't understand that as much as maybe he does, but it's a point of inertia that would prevent change at this upstream level.
Yeah, but what's going on right now that's real interesting is at the city level, they've just said, screw the Green Book, screw AASHTO, we're going to come up with our own manuals. And so there's this big project, really, where cities over the last 5-6 years, they're developing their own manuals, they're adopting the NACTA manual, they're reinventing their practice because they don't feel like the stuff that's been promulgated by AASHTO relates to the issues that they really have. And so getting into it at this level where you've got, this dynamic transformation in professional practice, I think is how we, certainly on the environmental side and perhaps on the organizational, how we tie into this and start bringing about a change in practice. I mean, most of these folks are, they're interested in safety, but really only insofar as it promotes. But nonetheless, that's the lever that we can, or more importantly, economic development, but those are levers that we can pull. We've got this widespread revision of our standard professional operating procedures, at least in urban environments. That's my focus. Rural ones are entirely different beast.
Eric, if you don't mind, I'm going to stop you there because I think you said you have Louis online to present, and we only have 15 more minutes on the call. So I wanted to make sure that he would have time as well.
Noreen, is there time for another quick question?
While like Louis's presentation is coming up.
But I'd say we need to come back to Eric's model and talk about it some more because it's stimulated a lot of great discussion.
Yeah, no, definitely.
I agree. Should we try to do it? How should we do it? Because I also have a couple of questions about the model.
Next call.
Well, one option would be we could get it on the second half of the next call, or we could make Louis's presentation the third 2018 presentation, but he's obviously has a beautiful PowerPoint ready to go for us now. So why don't we reserve the second half of the January call? So we'll kind of have two researchy sort of sections on that one, if that works with people.
Sounds good.
Okay. Louis?
So I'm going to talk more about, I was going to say some empirical work, although some of this is also a literature review. As background, what we've been doing, overall research question very similar to Eric's. What is the influence of the built environment? on traffic safety, and kind of two major research efforts underway currently. One is a literature review of the built environment and safety, and the second is an analysis of residential accessibility on traffic safety. I think I'm going to focus, given the limited time we have, just on the first. What we are doing here is basically analyzing studies of traffic safety at the macroscopic level. So rather than at a street segment level, at some aerial unit, such as a traffic analysis zone or a census block group, and reviewing the previous research on built environment correlates of crashes, of dangerous crashes. And I'm sure you all are already familiar with this, but the risk of traffic injury is a matter of both exposure and risk, and the probability of injury given a crash. Therefore, we can only assess the effect of the built environment on risk if we have an accurate assessment of exposure first. But what I was a little surprised to find in my literature review was that exposure was treated often either not explicitly or not in any kind of clear conceptual manner. So a lot of what the literature is showing us about the built environment is it's showing us the relationship between built environment and crash rates rather than crash risk, because very often we have poor measures of exposure, especially for bicyclists and pedestrians. So one of the ways I'm trying to deal with this is think about what built environment variables are most likely exposure variables, and what built environment variables are most likely risk variables, and which ones are ambiguous, or at least seem to be ambiguous. There's a lot of literature on the relationship between built-in density and crash rates, and it's interesting because you find actually both positive and negative correlations depending on which study you look at, but overall positive, but that's most likely exposure issue rather than a risk issue. Some variables that seem to be more likely risk-related are speed, number of lanes, sidewalks, traffic signals, bicycle paths. But then there's a number of variables where we have both mixed evidence and mixed interpretation, which are whether it is increasing the amount of risk or increasing the amount of exposure. There's a couple of studies about the number of intersections and whether this increases or decreases risk. Clearly, there's more opportunities for crashes at intersections, but then there's the argument that intersections slow down traffic. Mixed use and commercial land use, bus stops. There's a lot of studies that find correlation between commercial land uses and crash rates, but again, it's not at all clear to me that that's indicating these are actually more risky environments. They just may be more active environments. Disadvantaged demographic segments, we have typically higher crash risk, but in some cases crash rates, but in some cases lower crash rates. So, and I haven't cited any specific papers here. I've got the full write-up for anyone who's interested. Reviewed about 70, 80 papers. So one of the things that I'm recommending as a result of this is that researchers explicitly categorize their variables, whether they intend them to be exposure or risk variables, basically before the study begins. There's a lot of post hoc kind of post hoc explanations of what the variables are doing and why they're associated with higher crash rates that don't really elucidate causal reasons. Also, to select variables that are as close as possible to the actual causal issue of interest. A lot of built environment variables I see people discuss, well, the reason why it's increasing crash rates is because it's higher speeds. The reason why it's decreasing crash rates is lower speeds. That seems very speculative to me. If speed, speed is the variable of interest, we really ought to try and measure speeds. And perhaps do some kind of mediation analysis where we're showing that these variables are decreasing or increasing speeds. There's also a temptation to over-include variables just because they're available, where I would argue for more parsimonious models that indicate specific causal mechanisms. The other promising avenue, I think, for research on the built environment and risk, tie into Eric's earlier idea, is to hold certain aspects of the built constant and look at variations across those. So a series of studies by Jie Yuan, what's his name? Yu, where he looks at schools and the built environment surrounding schools, and holding the school environment constant, he can effectively analyze what raises and lowers risks around the school, as opposed to some of these studies that say schools are more risky, when really it's probably more of an exposure effect around the school. I think we could do something very similar for other types of built environments. For example, commercial areas. We could examine a range of commercial areas and determine what are the surrounding environments around them cause them to be higher or lower risk, rather than saying, okay, commercial environments are risky when really they're just concentrations of activity. So I do see some rays of light that could come out of improvements to the way we approach this research. Okay. I do want to stop there. Of course, anyone has can feel free to go through the second half of the slides and email me questions about the second research effort. But I think the first one is both more relevant to the audience and more relevant to what Eric discussed earlier. So I want to leave a little time for questions.
So this is Asad. I just have a simple question. Does new traditional developments or developments that are mixed use, ped bike friendly and compact, are those more likely or less likely to be safe when taken together based on the literature? Is there evidence of that compared to conventional developments that are not mixed use or very ped bike friendly?
So I haven't seen a study specifically on TNDs. In general, mixed use environments have higher crash rates, but I would not necessarily that means they're higher crash risk. Again, I think we have a conflation of the built environment's effect on exposure and its effect on risk in many of those cases. And if you look at a map of crashes with no controls, you will see the most crashes where the most people are and where the most activity is. You will see it in the downtowns and the activity centers, because that's where the most exposure is. So again, the problem is with something like TND. First of all, most of the crashes don't tend to happen in neighborhoods. Most of them happen in commercial areas and in arterial areas. But the other is that we don't have good exposure measures for pedestrians and bicyclists. So you actually might find more crashes, not necessarily higher crash risk, but you might find more crashes in the TNDs because there are more people walking and biking than them.
Right, but if we were to account for that, let's say, because we can predict the number of trips by bicycle or walking compared to auto in a traditional neighborhood development compared to a conventional development. So if we do account for that, would there be less or more? Would they be less or more safe?
I don't know.
Okay.
And I haven't seen a study that's specifically targeted to that question. Actually, that was one of the research ideas that we discussed a couple of weeks ago about what might be a year 2 project.
Right.
Well, we've done a couple of studies where we've measured volume at various intersections, either downtown areas or out in suburban areas, and invariably we find more crashes in downtown areas, but we find a higher risk in where there's less exposure, less VMT, or I'm sorry, less crossing. So I mean, some people call that the safety in numbers effect, but I've never seen an analysis that didn't show that. And anyway, so you have higher crashes in downtown areas where the people are and the cars are, but you have a lower risk per unit of travel. And no one's totally figured that one out yet, but that's an almost universal phenomenon.
Yeah, I agree. And David, if I could ask you to share with me your work, I'd really appreciate that. I think.
Oh, sure, I will. Yeah.
Yeah, I think the safety in numbers effect is well established, but there are a number of built environment variables where the literature is unsettled about whether it's an exposure effect or a risk effect. For example, are commercial areas actually more risky, or are they just locations with increased exposure?
Yeah, they're, and I a kind of hypothesis. Well, what it empirically appears to be is that there's more injuries, but the risk per unit of exposure is less. But I'll send you a couple of things we've done in that, and we used in that case built environment to help model pedestrian volume. We took pedestrian volume in maybe 20 or 30 intersections and then modeled the rest. I mean, one could question the validity of that, but we went through the steps of using built environment variables to help develop exposure measures for pedestrians.
Yeah, I'm going to cut in here because we only have 2 minutes left, and I know all of us are probably going off to other meetings. What I wanted to follow up with was what we had discussed about making sure there's more time to engage with the model that Eric showcased earlier. So I was going to basically propose that we split the next meeting into 30 minutes for Offer, 30 minutes for Eric, and then Eric, perhaps it would be possible to send something around in advance, and we can talk about this online, which is either just copies of your slides so people can kind of engage or think about as the mental map that Steve was talking about how you get in some of the feedback loops, perhaps in some of the elements that you've identified, or what these above the organizational elements are, or perhaps you have something that you've written or something that somebody else has written that you think would be productive for the group to read prior to that conversation. So if it would be useful to have a little bit of homework, Eric and I will talk about that offline and suggest that. So we're right at 2:59 now. Are there any last minute item that either the folks at HSRC need to say or that anybody on the call needs to share?
This is Jennifer. Just to follow up, we also recorded this call, so we will send out the recording if that would help with any homework for the following meeting. And I'll just say, a reminder about the upcoming, another reminder about the upcoming deadlines, and that you can go to the reporting page for any information you need on those. We also have an all-team meeting coming up in a few weeks as well, so you'll get information about that soon.
All right. Well, thanks everybody for your time. This was great.
Yeah, this format's very interesting.
Yeah, particularly thanks to our presenters. It was really generated a lot of discussion. So thank you very much for putting so much time into the prep.
My pleasure.
All right. Have a good